All right, so welcome back. This is the second installment of what will be a pretty large Let's Build that's going to be focusing on building for Ruby and Rails developers. The concept is not new. It's one that's just niched down to be basically a place for developers and that are specific to Ruby or Rails in particular to connect and or find jobs and maybe more at some point. So we'll see. I left off kind of just showing some concepts with wireframing of what I'm thinking this could turn into, but we'll see as we get rolling. This video is going to mostly focus on the data side of things. So when I typically kick off an app, this is kind of where I land. I'm using Notion, honestly, for the first time here, and there's a cool shark icon just because. Most of the time I typically reach for like a markdown file or something like that and just start listing out what I think attributes would be on database tables that I'm going to use with the app itself. So because it's a Rails based app, I'm going to, go the convention driven route and use a database for sure. And that typically will be a PostgreSQL database that will be in production. Maybe initially we'll use SQLite just to get things rolling. The initial idea is, okay, first thinking of the app, who's the primary target, what data is going to be moving around. And honestly, it's quite simple besides the fact of the different instances of a user. So I'm thinking there'll be, of course, an admin user. That'll be the person like who's got the control of doing most of the things on the site if they need to, like deleting a job or editing a job that might have some spam or something that needs to get taken down. You never know. But being able to add a job maybe from the back end is a nice thing, of course. At first, I feel like the app will be very self-serve from my perspective. I'll have to actually contribute, find Rails jobs and contribute and maybe post those initially. And then as maybe more employers or whoever looking for Rails devs might come and post their own job and seek developers. So in this case, I'm going to have a globalized user model, of course. Typically, we use Devise for that in past builds. I'll probably do that again. I haven't decided fully if I'm going to use like two different Devise objects in this app. I don't know that it's required, but I've seen it in practice, and it kind of makes sense. So we could use something like how you typically do like current user. You could use like current developer or current employer. I just don't know that I want an employer and developer to log in different places. That would be the edge case here. I feel like that would be kind of meticulous because then you might have some developers who want to impersonate employer and then they'll have multiple counts to keep track of. It's just kind of a mess that I don't know is where I'm going to end up there. I'll have to decide coming up pretty soon, but I'm thinking more or less just making it a flag of what type of user they may be, like a user type. But I'm not sure. We'll see how that pans out. An admin, of course, like the quick and easiest approach for an admin is just to set a Boolean on each of the user instances. And an admin, of course, will be true in that case. So that's what I'm thinking. At its core, I think we're going to use a cool gem called Name of Person by the Basecamp crew. And it actually requires two columns in the database. That's going to be first name and last name, but you can do a ton more with it. I'll link to it, I think, in this post that I'll come up with, but this is a very granular list in this case. So this is what I'm thinking for that. So yeah, the developer, employer, and admin are the main instances of the user that I'm thinking. So a developer will have different traits as well as an employer. Aside from that, the job is the main bread and butter of the app, as well as the community side of it. I'm thinking of using Chris from GoRails' Simple Discussion Gem. He just published this not too long ago, so props to him for this one. I think he extracted it from his forum at GoRails, which is a nice one, to be honest. It's got everything you really need, and he's done a great job there. So I'm thinking of using that. It comes with Bootstrap by default. We'll probably use Tailwind instead because that's just how I roll. I love Tailwind. And not Tailwind UI either. I just will roll my own custom Tailwind code. I think it's just more, I don't know, customizable in that regard, more branded. So with a job, we're going to have a title, a link to apply, because you could apply maybe using the form directly, but I feel like that's a little overkill for the app. I think like just linking out to where the person would apply makes more sense. There's other apps that companies use for something like that, like Lever, I think is an app that does like the job submission process. That's what it's best at, and it's a cool app. I've used it in the past at previous jobs. We'll link to that. So it'll just basically be a string column. Our job description, we'll use active or action text, I believe, which is part of Rails now, and it's a nice to have. Not the most awesome WYSIWYG, but it's a good one. We really won't need a ton of features of it. Like there's like file uploads and stuff. We'll probably just use the basic text formatting options. Then all the company details. For logos and file uploads, we're going to reach for active storage. That's also Rails default now. Used to use like a gem called Paperclip, and then one called Carrier Wave, and then there's another one called Shrine. They all work great, but active storage is kind of the default. If I don't have to reach for extra gems or dependencies, that's probably what I'm going to reach for most of the time. It comes with quirks, but for what we need, I think it'll work pretty well. Probably hook this up using AWS S3. You could use different providers out there like Azure or however you say that, among many that can come by default with Rails. So we'll see how that pans out. All the compensation style of stuff we'll need for the job. The role type I'm thinking will either be full-time, part-time, or maybe just contract, so freelance, and that can be dictated by what the compensation range would be. In that case, we can provide maybe some standardized defaults, but that could all live in like a constant in the model layer or something like that, just as data we don't really need to store, but just data we need as set values. And I'll get to how that'll work more along the lines coming up when we start scaffolding things out. But right now I'm just thinking about the data. I think years of experience will be a nice to have for the sake of the employer. So when they're actually searching for a developer in particular, they're going to look for, of course, experience, maybe their salary range, and then because they're on this site, I feel like you're going to either know Ruby or Rails. I don't know that we need to get into skills. But that's something that could be in the works if we want to, because some Rails developers don't really love JavaScript, at least the ones I've come across. But it's a nice skill to have if you want one developer who might know kind of the best of all worlds, or at least part of all the worlds, or just one that's really good at Rails and Ruby. So we'll see how that pans out. I think a time zone would be good. To add. That's one thing I don't think I added here, so I might need to add that as like a base time zone. And there's a gem we could use it for that too. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I think I've used it in the past. It works pretty well. It kind of like you can find, without even logging in, you can kind of, based on the browser, find the user's existing time zone, just based on their time clock and stuff like that in their browser. Like I said, we'll probably use this discussion concept from Chris at Go Rails. So that's going to take care of these other models. We don't really need to kind of scaffold our own approach towards a forum, but this gem will kind of handle that work for us, thankfully. There's a lot to kind of include, but it looks pretty simple to set up. So he's made it quite nice, in my opinion. So we'll get to that when we get to that. I feel like the community won't be my focus at first. It's going to be the users and the job criteria, because the job form itself is going to be pretty intense, I think. I'm building something kind of as an example on the side right now, just to kind of experiment and see which paths I want to go. It's entirely in Vue.js, and I use partially Stimulus to kind of mount it. So we're kind of using 3 different areas of technology in one, and it works pretty great, but it's also just kind of a pain to set up because the handiness of a Rails app is so great. You can get things done so quickly, but when you have to kind of scaffold this like multi-step form approach that I'm thinking about here, it gets kind of crazy. So with complexity, it just happens. I've got a list of gems I think I'll use. Some I may or may not, so don't take this to heart or with a grain of salt. Devise, of course. Sidekick I kind of use by default in my kickoff Tailwind template. I'll probably reach for that at first again, and then just go to town on it. It just saves me time installing Devise, installing Sidekick, setting up friendly ID down here. It kind of just does that. So I'll recommend you do the same if you're following along. Totally cool if you don't want to. If not, since this will be, I'm thinking a very RSS driven app, just so we have feeds of everything. I'm going to have background jobs going to town here for at least maybe if I do the newsletter, that part of it, just to kind of send digests automatically, so I don't have to like submit a form and send stuff manually, even though a V1 with that would be totally fine. But RSS is kind of automatic, so I won't really need to do much with it, but we will need to set that up, and it's a fun little thing to take on, to be honest. Like, you get back to old school stuff like XML and Atom feeds. Well, you'll definitely use Stripe and Stripe Event. I've been using another one from Chris and Jason Charnes called Pay. It's a fantastic gem that kind of wraps around Stripe and Braintree if you want to have multiple payment processors and skip all the very crazy code that goes along with some of that stuff, especially with the new SEA stuff from Stripe, and just accepting payments anywhere. It becomes a chore. It used to be super easy, and now it's getting more complicated, which kind of is a pain in the ass, but we'll get there. So we're going to deal with that. A lot of payment stuff for the job board, and possibly subscription model for employers who maybe want to have finer tuned mechanisms to find developers. This isn't set in stone. I don't know if these features will be like, unless you're paid employer style user, can you access these filters? Something like that is what I'm thinking. And then Pagi is the quickest pagination gem out there at the moment, so we'll deal with that one. Just for job listings that get pretty long, I imagine we'll have this kind of continue on and on. I hate the infinite load pattern. I feel like it's a terrible experience because maybe if your page refreshes, you suddenly have to go do it all again and again, and it's just, I think of throwing way too much at a problem that doesn't need to be solved in such a way. We'll need the SDK from AWS to kind of handle active storage. By default, there's a built-in adapter for it. You just have to pass in credentials, so it's pretty easy to set up, but also just one more thing to do. Inline or image processing we'll do for avatar uploads, not avatar, but the job company logo uploads. We'll want to either process those down and kind of either crop them to a set width and height, or just do some background stuff to keep those in a consistent fashion when they're displayed on the site. Besides the job up here, I will add, I'm sure, more attributes here. I'm thinking like you'll even be able to do some upsells in the time of purchasing a job, where you can have it featured for a set time or something like that. I think I just want to get the job object completed, and then we'll go back and add those nice things to have. Maybe you can customize the appearance or something even. It'd be kind of neat. So inline SVG, I use this in every app. It's just a nice to have. I for all icons anymore, I use SVGs just because they scale infinitely. You don't need to worry about resolution or file size so much, which is great. Honeybadger is an error tracking app. So honeybadger.io. It's like a team of 5 people. I really like these guys. They have a great podcast I listen to, and I think it's just a great error tracking app. I mean, you don't really need everything under the sun. It provides all you need and more, and there's also a little free plan, which think I'm going to go with at first, until this is maybe a paid thing or a commercial-based app, and we need more than that. That's just handy to have in case something melts down on the site, if there's exceptions or maybe we missed something. My pattern is more or less, I don't really like Slack, but I like it for these types of things. So I'll add an app to a Slack channel that's just based on error alerts or something for myself. I don't even have people in there, and it will notify me there as opposed to sending me crazy amounts of email. But you could do both if you want. Redis is useful for, I think we'll use it a lot for background jobs, of course, but also maybe some active action cable stuff. There's a few gems out there that are kind of getting buzz, like Stimulus, Reflex, and stuff like that, or what is it, Cable Ready, that allow you to just update things like almost DOM diffing in real time without using front-end frameworks. I don't know that I would need that much in this app. Maybe when new jobs are posted or something, I don't know. They could just like pop in the view instead of you having to refresh the page. A little bit of overkill in my opinion, but you never know. We'll see where we end up. Like I said, I'm going to use PostgreSQL for the in database. That's just typically what you see in production sites. Heroku kind of depends on that. I'm probably going to use Hatchbox for the actual app. That's another one from Chris GoRails. You can see he's well versed in the community. His app, it's just cheaper and honestly more dependable than Heroku has been for me in the past. And I don't have to learn any crazy command line crap, which is great. You just do it all based on Git hooks. SendGrid, I'll use mostly the free tier for emails at first. They, I believe, at least in my past, have the best free plan up until you have to pay. That's just me being cheap. But when I'm testing out ideas, I don't really want to spend too much money on those. So that's where I'll end up for email sending, for maybe the newsletter stuff, or just digest of new jobs and developers that enter the app. So we'll do some work with mailers and whatnot. This is that name of person gem. Really cool gem from the Basecamp crew. The reason it's cool is you just basically, you add these two columns to your user table and insert this method, or I'm assuming it's like a module. And then you have suddenly access to that person's name, first name, last name, initials, familiar name, so like David.h, abbreviated, sorted, all this crazy cool stuff that you wouldn't normally need to do, but comes in handy more than you think. So that's it. And they're basically not contributing to it at all anymore, but it's not very much under the hood to really worry about anyway. So on top of that, we'll have friendly ID. Again, that comes by default in my kickoff template. That's just nice for slugs. So maybe if a job is posted, I'll have the title of the company or the title of the job as the slug instead of like an ID number. That's hard to remember. So if anyone wanted to share it, there's a nicer public URL for it that's just more brandable and easy to remember. I'm thinking this might be long term, but we can do OmniAuth with Google and Twitter to just give people options of logging in with those instead of actual email password combos that Devise ships with. Just kind of a nice to have. I don't particularly like doing that with my stuff unless it's like work related, but it's okay. It's not the greatest experience though. In terms of the development environment, these would all be like production stuff we'd use in production. Development would be more or less just nice tools that I like to use that, whatever. You can use what you want. The Faker gem is kind of a must. Just fake data for seeds and tests is great to have. Pry Rails, I prefer this over Bybug personally. It's just nicer looking. They both work great, but Pry just gives you a little more, like in your IRB console and stuff, gives you some more granular stuff to see what's going on when maybe an error happens or you're trying to debug what's going on in an object or whatnot. Annotate's a great gem just to have this nice annotated comment list of what fields you have in your database and your models and tests. So you can see that stuff instead of having to go to like your schema and seeing what's going on every time, even though I do that probably anyway. But it's just a nice to have. So that's about it in terms of getting the data in my mind set up. I need to decide, like I said, if I'm going to have instances of developer and employer, completely different instances. But I feel like that's a little overkill, but it might be easier in the long run. You never know. So we'll decide that coming up. I think the next step here is kind of kicking off getting the app in a developer ready state. So we'll install these development gems, some of these other gems. We don't need to install everything under the sun at first, but just when we need it, so we're not going crazy with gems. I want to maybe install the gem for this, maybe get it at least set up in terms of the documentation. Maybe we won't start with the community, but and then we can start to add our first users and job modeling, maybe get some of the views looking good and kind of a design in place too. So expect that to come next. Thanks for following along. If you're planning on it, this will be a very long series. I'm just warning you now. I hope it's not a pain to watch, but I hope it's also useful. So, all right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.